Thank you so much, and please join me again in congratulating Dr. Dehaene for that magnificent talk. He revealed to me that his flight from France landed an hour before the start of his talk, so it's all the more remarkable. Both as a neuroscientist and as a mother of a 5-year-old emerging reader, I really found it quite exquisite data. One question that I was left with was, what about individual variation? So what are the factors that determine how well a child will learn how to read? In a draft version of his talk that he graciously shared with the discussants last week, he concluded saying that there were 3 main variables that predict success: knowledge of phonemes, size of the child's vocabulary, and the presence of books. And I thought that the latter factor was particularly interesting, as it's quite likely that the presence of books in the home itself reflects economic resources. This is a map that was published in the New York Times several years ago, showing the prevalence of reading failure across the city. And what you might notice is that areas depicted in the darker colors represent areas where reading failure is relatively less common, and you see that in areas like Manhattan that are quite gentrified. In contrast, in areas represented by the lighter colors, areas like the South Bronx, that are plagued by extraordinarily high levels of poverty, we see incredibly high levels of reading failure, in some cases in excess of 70% of students. Now, the emergence of socioeconomic disparities in school achievement is nothing new. There were data published several years ago by the British cohort study that followed tens of thousands of children longitudinally in the UK from about age 2 to about age 10. So if I could draw your attention first to children who started out performing at the 90th percentile on a battery of cognitive tasks at age 2, who came from socioeconomically advantaged homes, we see that those children from high socioeconomic backgrounds who were high early scorers tended to perform above average throughout the course of childhood. Next, if you consider children who started out at the 10th percentile at age 2, who happen to come from socioeconomically disadvantaged homes, well, those low early scoring children from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds tended to perform below average throughout the course of childhood. Perhaps nothing so surprising so far. A bit more surprising, though, is what happened when we consider what we might term the crossover groups. So first, considering children who also started out at the 10th percentile at age 2, but who happened to come from more economically advantaged homes. So those children from higher SES homes who were low early scorers actually improved in their relative rank, in their percentile, across the course of childhood. And finally, and most disconcertingly, what happened to those children who were outperforming 90% of their same age peers at age 2, but who happened to come from socioeconomically disadvantaged homes? Well, those children from lower SES homes who were low early scorers actually fell in their percentile, in their relative rank over the course of childhood, such that by age 10, family socioeconomic circumstance is a much better predictor of school achievement than is early cognitive skill. And so this begs the question as to whether all reading impairments are the same. Is a child who struggles with reading in the context of limited access to resources fundamentally the same as a child who struggles with reading despite plentiful access to resources? So some of the work from our lab suggests that indeed these two types of readers may be quite different, that children who struggle with reading in the context of limited access to resources may show typical neurobiological patterns, whereas children who struggle with reading despite plentiful access to resources actually show atypical neurobiological patterns. Now, more recent work in our lab has looked at how family economic circumstance, family income, relates to the very structure of children's brains. And what we found is that higher family income is associated with larger cortical surface area, larger brain size, across most of the brain. But there were several areas that showed particularly strong links, shown here in yellow, so areas of the temporal lobe and inferior frontal lobe that are known to support language, as well as not included on this slide, but if we were to flip it under and look at the underside of the brain, we would see that the visual word form area that we heard our speaker speak so eloquently about shows dramatic socioeconomic disparities in structure. A couple of points to note about this finding. This relationship between economic circumstance and child brain structure isn't linear, but indeed we see the strongest relationship between family income and brain size among the most disadvantaged children, suggesting that dollar for dollar, small increases in family income are associated with proportionately greater differences in brain structure among the poorest families. And another point that I just have to make is that, yes, across this large study, in this case it was over 1,000 children and adolescents, we do see this strong relationship between family income and brain structure, and yet there's dramatic variation from one person to the next. So there were plenty of children from economically advantaged homes who had smaller brain surfaces, plenty of children from disadvantaged homes who had larger brain surfaces. So in no way could I know an individual child's family income and predict with any accuracy what that particular child's brain structure looked like. So what about moving past this question of correlation then, right? So can we say with any certainty whether differences in economic resources are causing these differences in brain development and behavior, or simply correlated? So to begin to move beyond correlation and actually address this question of causality, I'm really pleased to be directing, along with a team of social scientists, the first clinical trial of poverty reduction in the US. The goal of the study is large, although the premise is quite simple. Briefly, our plan is to recruit 1,000 low-income mothers from across the United States, randomize half to receiving a large monthly income supplement, the other half to receiving a nominal monthly income supplement, and then follow the development of these children's brains and minds over the first 3 years of life, when we believe that the developing brain is most malleable to experience. Now, this initial study, which we're planning to launch this spring, will follow these children for the first 3 years, as I mentioned, but certainly our hope is to follow these families longer term to see whether increased economic resources may, in fact, serve to bolster children's reading development, among many other potential outcomes. Now, when compared to our developed country peers, the US is really lagging in terms of the size of public spending on children and families. For comparison, here is France. But it doesn't have to be this way. So if we look at the poverty rate over time, comparing seniors, shown in blue, versus children, shown in reddish-orange, what you see is that in the late 1950s, the rate of poverty for senior citizens was quite high, affecting more than 1 in 3 senior citizens. And yet, with the advent of public policies like Medicare and Social Security, we've seen that number slowly decline to fewer than 1 in 10 today. In contrast, if we look at the rate of childhood poverty, that number has been affected by the advent of things like Medicaid, and yet, because we haven't prioritized children as a society, that number today is closer to 1 in 5. So our hope is that our work will provide direct evidence of the effects of poverty reduction on the developing brain and mind, potentially informing debates about the generosity or cuts to existing as well as new social service programs that affect millions of families with young children. So while I would certainly never argue that income is the only or even the most important factor in determining children's brain or reading development, it may be one of the most manipulable from a policy perspective. So many thanks to my lab funders and collaborators, and thanks again to our distinguished speaker.